Good morning, everyone. Thanks for taking the time to tune in. I hope everybody is doing as safe and well as possible under the circumstances. My name is Eric Calvert. I'm one of the associate directors at the Center for Talent Development at Northwestern University. We're a comprehensive gifted education center housed within the School of Education and Social Policy. And specifically, I work largely with our online programs. We've been in operation for almost 30 years. So we've evolved through the entire technological evolution of distance learning from literally postal mail correspondence courses all the way up to rich media, fully interactive online programs that now serve about 1,500 students all around the world. So it's been kind of an interesting journey. We are fortunate that we've been able to take it over a very extended time frame. We know that many of you, however, are scrambling to transition from being a face-to-face school to being an online school in a very short period of time. So the focus today is to try to give you some immediately applicable tips and suggestions that you can share with your colleagues back at school and hopefully help make the best of this really difficult circumstance that we all find ourselves in. As Arlen mentioned, a recording of this session will be made available not long after we wrap up, but if you are a kind of person that likes to follow along with slides yourself, you can access these at the bit.ly link at the bottom of the screen. Just be aware that those characters are case sensitive, so you want to use all lowercase. But for now, I'm going to power ahead and kind of give you a topical overview of some of the things that we want to cover this morning. So I've spent a little bit of time over the last few weeks trying to make myself available to various groups on social media for teachers that are looking for strategies and suggestions and have a lot of questions. And the questions that I'm hearing most often are, first, is it safe enough? Is it private enough? And how would we know if it is? Is it accessible? In other words, is this something that most of our students, including some of our students with special learning needs, would be able to get in and use successfully with minimal instruction? Does the potential for enhancing learning outweigh the learning curve of mastering the new technology? Does it reinforce school goals and values? In other words, does this align with who we are? Can students actually take creative products that they make using the tool with them when the class is over? And I'll talk about why that's important later in the webinar. And finally, some online learning considerations that are really specific to the coronavirus outbreak era are, does it work on a variety of devices? If students will be using it on borrowed devices from school, does anything special need to be done by a district IT department to make that work? Is it a tool that will function adequately for students that have more modest internet bandwidth at home? And finally, can it or an equally good alternative be used by students with disabilities with the level of support that you can realistically provide to those students remotely? So that's a big list of questions, and I know you probably brought questions with you as well. So as we go, I encourage you to type those into the chat box so Arlen can pick out some that are representative of the group. But now let's dive in and talk about some answers. So first, a really burning question for a lot of people, because we do want to keep students safe, even if they're not physically in our classrooms. Is with respect to online security and privacy. And I'm not going to go into a lot of law and policy on this webinar, but the one piece of legislation that I think it's worth getting a little bit familiar with is called COPPA, and that's the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And this is a federal law that's enforced by the FTC on companies that provide web services that have the potential for collecting individually identifiable data from users. So COPPA was enacted to help regulate how companies can go about collecting information about children who are 13 and under and what they can do with that data once it's collected. But the two, I think, most important provisions to be aware of for a school is that first, To be COPPA compliant, web services and apps have to have clear, easily accessible privacy policies that detail what kinds of data is going to be collected from users and how that data is going to be used. And then the second key provision of COPPA is this idea of what they call verifiable parental consent. So one thing to know is that in theory, you could use almost any app or any site on the web and be compliant with COPPA if you've shared the privacy policy of that site or tool with parents, and they've given you a signature that says it's okay for my child to use this site. Of course, we would prefer to use tools that protects children's privacy by default, however. So some things that you can do if you're trying to evaluate for yourself if an app or a web service is likely to be COPPA compliant. First, is a login account required to use the site? In other words, do you have to provide the site or the app some information before you can get in and start making use of the tools or the service that's behind it? If it doesn't require somebody to create an account or to provide login credentials from a third-party login tool like LinkedIn or Facebook or Google, then odds are it's not collecting the level of personal information that would raise red flags under COPPA. But if users are required to create accounts, then the first thing that you should do is look for something called either terms of service or user agreement or terms of use policy. Pretty much every app in the app store for your phone will have one of these in the description, and most websites also will have these. And what you want to do, and I know that these are tedious to read and often many pages long and seem like they're written by lawyers and not for students and teachers. But one thing that you can do a quick skim for, and I'll often just do Control F or Command F, depending on what computer I'm looking for, and then just look for 13. And the reason why I look for 13 is that that's the age below which COPPA applies. And so many apps that are not designed with COPPA in mind will avoid COPPA-related issues simply by requiring that to create an account, users have to claim they're at least 13 years old. Because if the provider thinks you're 13, then all of the protections of COPPA that are designed for students who are under 13 don't apply. That's kind of your first red flag. If you go to a site, you look at the terms of service and it says that users must be 13 or older, or any age or older that's above 13, then that's usually a red flag that the site isn't designed with COPPA in mind. Second, a good thing to check is whether or not there is an education version of the site or app that's available in addition to the regular version. Apps and services that are designed specifically for the K-12 market or the children's market are typically designed with COPPA compliance in mind. But know that many apps exist in multiple versions or offer many different kinds of accounts, some of which may be COPPA compliant and others that may not be. So for example, one of the most kind of popular discussions and debates that we've seen in social media about teaching during COVID-19 is it safe to use Zoom, or is it safe to use Google, or is it safe to use X? But what's important to understand is that if you just tell students to go to google.com and create their own accounts, and get, Gmail, regular gmail.com email addresses and regular gmail.com, Google Drive accounts, by default, those are not COPPA compliant. But if your school uses Google Suite for Education, the way Google treats the user data for that is very different. For example, they don't mine content to do targeted advertising on the the K-12 education version of Google Suite. So in other words, using Google with a google.com account is not COPPA compliant, but using the education version is probably okay. The same is true for many of the video conferencing apps that are out there. So a takeaway, just be cautious about generic online advice that you see in social media forums about what's okay and what's not okay. Often compliance isn't just about what app is used, but how it's used. So Google can be compliant or not, Zoom can be compliant or not, and this is true of many other services as well. You're probably on safe ground if you're using a tool that your district IT person has recommended, but if you're out there trying to find things on your own, hopefully this gives you kind of a few tips. So beyond compliance and basic safety, then kind of the next lens that we want to look through is appropriateness for use by students. And I kind of like the old Othello board game tagline from the commercials from the 80s, which was a minute to learn, a lifetime to master. I think that's really, the ideal to look for if you can when selecting online apps, something that students can immediately get in and get some things done or start finding their way around, but also particularly in tools that we pick that are for students to be able to do things that are more creative. There's opportunity for students to expand their knowledge, and there's ability of that tool to kind of scale up to be able to meet more complex needs as students and teachers become more comfortable with the platforms. Some things to look for in terms of evaluating whether or not an app or a website is likely to be perceived as intuitive to use by your stakeholders. Some simple things. One, the menus and navigation buttons are clearly labeled. Things do what they say they'll do. Second is that the navigation is largely consistent across the app or site. So menus don't move around a lot. Buttons don't move around a lot. Once we kind of learn how to use one screen, then that knowledge can transfer to other parts of the interface. It's also advantageous if you can find tools and websites that were designed to look similar to other tools that your students are already familiar with. For example, at CTD, with our K-12 students, we use Schoology as our learning management system, although our university uses Canvas with graduate and undergraduate students. But part of the reason why we chose Schoology over the university's platform is, one, the interface design at the time was designed to where when students first logged on, what they saw looked very much like their social media stream on Instagram or Facebook. It was very intuitive for them to jump in and use. The other reason why we wanted our own platform is we wanted to have more fine-grained control so that we can make sure that we're doing things that are safe with students and giving them access to the wider web and other people in kind of a phased-in way as is developmentally appropriate. You also want to look for simplicity in the interface, particularly when students are first getting started in online learning. And related to that, minimal hoops to jump through before meaningful use can begin. Another thing that can be a real barrier is if before a student can actually start using an app, they have to create an account, they have to link that to other apps, they have to go through, a forced tutorial before they ever actually get to the thing. So you want as few hoops as possible in order to let students get started. You also want to try to make sure as much as possible that the vocabulary used in the app or service is comprehensible to your students, or is at least supplemented by clear and meaningful iconography, particularly using symbols as they are used elsewhere on the web. Of course, some tools might have specialized vocabulary, which is completely fine. But then you might have to plan, before you introduce that more complex tool, to do some vocabulary building with students before you attempt to introduce that tool or platform. And then lastly, and we'll come back to this idea of modeling quite a bit as we move through the session, but the last thing that I would mention is that even with the most simple tools, there is some learning curve. And so one of the best things that we can do for students right now is to model figuring out how to use software, including kind of talking aloud and thinking aloud how you are trying to solve a problem or figure out how to use some aspect of the interface. So if you're confused or frustrated, or a teacher that you're working with is confused or frustrated by some piece of software, that's great. That's a natural opportunity to share strategies that you're using to master with your kids. So you might demo showing them things like visiting the help menu. It might be, you might model, asking a tech-savvy colleague. You might model, submitting a question to, the help support forum. But document and show for students that just because we don't know how to do something doesn't mean we stop. It means that we work in a different way to try to problem solve. Then kind of continuing our exploration of the idea of complexity is also kind of balancing what the potential benefits of introducing an app or web service are versus the time and frustration involved in climbing that initial learning curve in order to be able to make use of it. And so one thing that I like to recommend to teachers that work in our online programs is that as they're introducing new tools, to think about the idea of cognitive load and the reality that all of us have a limited amount of working memory and attention. We think of students with ADHD as being students who have limited working memory and attention, but they basically just represent, an extreme end of the continuum. The reality is that all of us have limits, and most of us are able to kind of grapple with about 7 bits or so of information at any given time. And if there's more information than that coming at us, some of it we just have to let go because we can't process it. So kind of a useful concept to think about is what's called automaticity. And the idea of automaticity is that when we first learn to use a brand new tool, we have to dedicate a lot of our working memory just to manipulating that tool. So now, I'm in my mid-40s. I've been using pencils and pens and crayons and chalk and highlighters and all those things for many, many, many decades now. So when I want to write something down, I just have to think of the thought, and then my hand kind of makes the movements without me really having to invest a lot of working memory. But if I was 3, to accomplish the same task, I would have to invest a lot of my working memory and attention in thinking about the fact that if I want the tip of the pen to go up, that I need to pull back on my index finger and push forward with my thumb. So, it's a high cognitive load task because I'm new at that point, but over time that gets smaller. So that's an argument in favor of introducing tools that, particularly those that are potentially high value but are also higher in complexity, introduce them, but then before you require students to actually do anything high stakes with them, like completing a major assignment for points or taking an exam for points, or doing a presentation to their classmates, allow some time just for them to play around with the interface. To click all the buttons and see what happens, to experiment, and then whatever they create, let them know it's perfectly fine to put it in the trash. But what we're doing there is giving them a little bit of time to develop enough automaticity that then their full working memory is then available to the task of learning before when we ultimately move on. And then another category of concerns that I've seen a lot about, which I think is encouraging, because this is kind of where I come from. I'm a gifted education person, and previously I was, housed in the Office for Exceptional Children at the Ohio Department of Education. So I'm really sensitive to these kind of outlier students that often can get left behind as we, rush to kind of race to the middle. So I wanted to share a few tips that I hope will be helpful. So first of all, I think this is an ideal time to kind of think back to those universal design for learning principles, particularly that idea of providing content to students using multiple means of representation, and allowing multiple means of engagement. And what that means is that rather than providing critical information in, say, only one reading, or only one video, or in only one podcast, or in only one educational game, if we know that we have students that have very different learning modality strengths and some students that have pretty pronounced deficits in some areas, we might provide both of those or three of those or four of those, but then also provide most students the option of using the one that they like, or to try one and then take a mini quiz, and if it seemed like the master moved on, if not, go back and try one of the other forms. But the more forms of media we can offer, then the more likely we are to provide an option that fits kind of the area of strength for all students. And that's really the key here, trying to cater to our students with disabilities strengths as much as we can while they're away from us, and harder to provide that high level of direct human support to. Second, remember that the most common accommodations that we provide to K-12 students with disabilities in schools are extended time and reading aloud of content. And that's because specific learning disabilities and attention deficit issues are by far the most commonly diagnosed categories of disabilities within K-12 schools. So think about how some of those strategies that you would use to provide accommodations and support in regular classrooms might translate online. So kind of one point I would make here is that we want to keep what we call the synchronous activities relatively short and focused. So, I think for young students, the ideal length for a live meeting is probably somewhere between 5 and 10 minutes, and no more than 40 minutes for older students. But I certainly think it would be difficult for any of us to sit and stay engaged with a live Zoom meeting or a live webinar all day long. But also know that when we do things synchronously, then that means we're setting the pace. And so students for whom that pace is appropriate are fine, but students who might need something repeated, or students who might be bored because they really need to get information more quickly, aren't always ideally served by those synchronous activities, even though we really like the sense of community that they can provide. So we do use them, but we don't use them as the sole or even primary mode of delivering really critical content. Then capitalize on asynchronous tools to allow students to adjust pace as needed. When we think about the needs of our gifted students, for example, what often really benefits them are opportunities to actually move through content faster and not slower. And in fact, there are some studies that suggest their achievement goes down if the pace is too slow. They don't overlearn, they tune out. But similarly, there are some topics that are new to us or more challenging to us, where all of us would really benefit from an opportunity to slow down or to experience that topic through 2 or 3 different lenses, or have additional practice before we move on. And all of that flexibility is much easier to do in an asynchronous environment where what I'm working on and what my colleague Susan is working on if we were in the same class, and maybe what Randy is working on. We can all be in different places at the same time, but when we're not physically in the same classroom, we're not distracting each other anyway, so that can work really beautifully. Next, help students who would benefit get access to software that provides real-time closed captioning of audio. And fortunately, a lot of online video, if you're going out to just look for content to bring into whatever you're using for your online spaces, already has closed captioning embedded within it. Most YouTube videos, for example, if you click the CC button, will pop up closed captioning. But if you are creating original content, say your teachers are recording a video, then you need to do this yourself. And probably my favorite tool at the moment is called Google Recorder. It's a downloadable app for Android devices and I think some Chrome devices, but it does a really amazing job of accurately transcribing text. So if you don't have a tool for that yet, I highly recommend that you guys check that one out. Then a few key topics on web design to bear in mind, particularly for making web content accessible to students who might have visual impairments that depend on screen readers. The good news is that the technology of screen readers has moved along quite well. So there are many people with total vision loss who navigate the web successfully every day. But some things that we can do to help make that a less frustrating experience are first to value simplicity over visual pop as we create those sites. So using simple, large fonts with plenty of white space, use solid color backgrounds, ideally black text on white background, or vice versa. Images are still great for most students, but to avoid them causing confusion for students that are visually impaired, it's helpful that we label those image files we upload with descriptive names. So, if I, for whatever reason, wanted to insert a picture of an apple onto my class homepage, I might, go out online, find an image that is covered by a Creative Commons license that I'm free to download and reuse in my own site and upload that. But if the file name of that photo file is something like 1275987_AB423, if I'm trying to consume that content with the screen reader, I'm not going to have any idea what that image is. But it's helpful if I just change that 917423 _ whatever that long and not human meaningful file name was to applephoto.jpg. Now that's more accessible to those students with disabilities. And then lastly, encourage students to create a dedicated learning space where they have some control of the environment. And I think this is particularly valuable advice for students that we know struggle with managing their own attention. Obviously there's a limited amount that we can do to modify the child's capacity to have a longer attention span in all settings while we're not, physically with them to do high contact kinds of interventions. But what we can do is try to at least help them screen out as many distractors as possible so that they can get the most bang out of the attention that they have. So this might include, encouraging students to do some things like, make signage so people in their house know when they're listening to when they have their headphones on and they're listening to school versus just listening to music. Or, even if it's just, taping off, a corner of the kitchen table, that says, this is Susan's, between, the hours of, 8:30 and 2:30 every day, where we're creating kind of private space. But students tell us that is really valuable and powerful. So kind of talk to them about that. A good way that teachers can teach that is to model kind of how they're trying to create the most workable space possible in their houses, and how they're trying to negotiate with other people that might be under their own roof to limit those distractions. And then finally, remember that tolerance for frustration in learning activities is malleable. And so when we don't care about something and we find that thing frustrating, we will usually try it once or twice and then quit. But when something is frustrating or challenging, but we really, really care about what we're going to create with it, or we're really interested in getting the answer, even though we might try and fail and try and fail and try and fail and try and fail, and then have to ask a friend, and then have to ask a different friend, and then have to ask the teacher before we can figure it out. If we care about the answer, we'll do those things and get where we need to be. And I think we should assume that there's going to be a lot of frustration over the next few weeks. And so the more we can tap into things that students find intrinsically interesting, then we will be more advantaged in being able to power through the frustrations that students will encounter while they're climbing these initial learning curves. The next concept that I'd like to reinforce, and this is particularly applicable to tools that we might be using to have students do things that are creative, whether that's creating artwork or whether that's writing, formal papers, or that are process oriented, where we're asking them to collect resources, and those kinds of things. One thing that we've noticed about online learning is that because so much of online learning takes ideas out of students' and teachers' heads and captures them, into a space that we can go back to and revisit, that those spaces can actually become functionally almost like a new part of students' memories. I was really surprised a few years ago. I was teaching a graduate level class in educational technology, and just as an experiment, we tried to run the entire class just in a simple wiki. And it worked out pretty well. But the thing that was really interesting to me to see, because the site the wiki tool provided analytics, so I could see who was visiting what parts of the wiki when, and kind of my expectation was that after we finished the first week of class and moved on to the second week, that everybody would be focused on the content that's in the second week, and nobody would be in the third week, and nobody would be in the first week. But what I actually found is that as the class went on, students would frequently go back to previous discussions or to look at content in previous units to review, to kind of look at their own growth. But as it turned out, those discussions that we had in those early weeks actually became in part important resources that those students wanted to go back to. And so now we try to always pick tools that students, if they're leaving or graduating, or the tool is going away, that there's some way to export their work so they haven't lost that investment. So that's another suggestion that I would encourage you to factor in as you're looking at tools. And then finally, we kind of want to think about selecting these tools through the lens of our own goals and values. And I think this is an important thing to give a little bit of thought, because a lot of schools are making different choices, and many of those can be legitimate. But rather than just picking stuff because the district down the road is using it, really kind of think about what matters to us, and what do we want our students to be like when they graduate and move on from us. So And particularly right now, we know that this is going to, the whole crisis that we're living through is going to throw our curriculum scope and sequence up in the air. And maybe that's okay. And we do know that governors in a lot of states now have suspended annual testing for this spring. So if we don't cover every standard and indicator as we might have in a normal spring, you know, maybe that's not such a big deal because we're not going to be immediately penalized on this. But I would kind of think ahead, you know, for the next several years to what students might be encountering as they matriculate, and then pulling ahead those skills that would be particularly valuable and particularly interesting now as we are living through, you know, this particular moment in history. So some things I would encourage districts to think about moving up and to become part of the content that they teach this spring might be things like basic technology skills. You know, this is a natural learning opportunity for that. And every new technology skill that a student acquires now is probably going to relieve some frustration that they have when it's time then to switch gears and learn some math or learn some reading. The second skill that I think this is a great time to teach all students is touch keyboarding. This is an immensely valuable skill, particularly for those students that you know, we want to go on to college. We were actually doing a curriculum research grant with some high need schools in Ohio, and we're trying to find a way to get advanced learning content you know, to these students. So we were leveraging online learning for that, but initially we were really frustrated by what we felt were pretty shallow online discussions. But then when we went to the school and physically observed, you know, we found that the students were actually very bright and thoughtful and articulate, but they were struggling to be bright and articulate and thoughtful in an online discussion because they were all hunt and peck typers. And so each word they typed would take them several seconds. And so that really limited, you know, how much they could share. And so we stepped back, introduced a couple of typing games that students really liked. It wasn't tedious at all, like when I was learning touch keyboarding in 7th grade. But, you know, they developed those skills and it really enhanced the quality of instruction. And then that skill they'll have for the rest of their lives. So touch keyboarding, can't recommend it enough. Also, critical thinking skills. You know, we talk about these as being important a lot as educators, but I think this is particularly important now that there's a lot in the news, you know, about, you know, how to evaluate the accuracy of content that we're seeing about the coronavirus and these different treatments. So there's a natural tie-in to tie that stuff into the news, where then what they're going to see and hear outside of class will reinforce ideas that you've introduced. This is also a great time to focus on informal writing skills. We focus a lot on formal writing skills, like how to compose an essay, you know, how to compose an argument, but you know, in adult life, a lot of the writing that we do is in email, it's in online discussion boards, it's in, you know, Twitter posts, it's in text messages to, you know, friends and family and colleagues. So this is a great time to talk about informal writing and writing as communication. And another thing that I would like to call out about this point that we've observed watching a lot of students become online learners for the first time. And what we often see is when students come online for the first time and are faced with an online discussion, because they don't have any kind of concept of what is, you know, socially acceptable in that context. What they will often post is either, you know, something very short and shallow. You know, they'll wait for somebody else to post something and then say, I agree, or good job, or I disagree, without a lot of explanation. Or they'll write, they'll, you know, kind of dust off the formal learning that they've done about writing, and, you know, in an online discussion board, they'll create, you know, a perfect 5-paragraph essay, which is great, but it's not conversational. So to help them with that, you know, provide models, talk about why you're using an online discussion space and how what you're looking for writing for that space is different from what you might be looking for when you have students write a formal paper. And let students know that in those online discussions, what you're really interested in is the thoughtful and courteous exchange of ideas. But I would discourage you from grading discussion board posts for things like grammar, spelling, and syntax, because that's going to make students take longer to do those posts, and that will interrupt kind of that flow of conversation. So kind of pick your battles and pick your forums. Government and social studies is also a great topic to introduce right now. Particularly, I think we're coming up on kind of a potential constitutional crisis where governors and the president will be debating kind of who has authority to, extend close downs and things like that. So this is a great time to talk about that, since there'll be things in the news that reinforce it. Similarly, life science content, everything that you hear on television is about biology right now. So, a perfect time to talk about that content. And then finally, this is also a great moment to talk about non-cognitive and metacognitive skills. These are skills that are beneficial for making the most out of kind of our natural mental abilities. So it's a great time to talk with students about strategies for emotional self-understanding and self-regulation. A lot of our online teachers right now are doing almost daily kind of just temperature taking, like, on a scale of 1 to 5, how do you feel today? But those kinds of things. But also sort of model how educators are grappling with the same stresses to encourage students to be able to kind of acquire similar skills and apply kind of similar kind of management techniques. And then lastly, strategies for time management and organization. And we've noticed, even though we primarily work with gifted and academically advanced students, even some of the sharpest, most academically advanced kids don't automatically come with great organizational skills or time management skills. These seem to be skills that students have to learn and acquire. Often they learn and acquire them out of necessity. The level of challenge rises where they need a system in order to be able to get things done, but it's much less stressful if students can be exposed to how other people approach organizing their time and their resources. So I think it's a great time for teachers to share how they're doing it, and maybe to have a class activity where students are talking about what strategies they're using or what strategies other people in their households are using for this, so that we're equipping students with skills that will be helpful through the coronavirus outbreak, but then will also be helpful when they take their first AP class or when they go to college. Then to touch briefly on some strategies for dealing with bandwidth issues. Another topic that we've seen in a lot of discussion forums is, how do we deal with the fact that not all of our students have broadband, or not all of our students have their own device? And first, I wanted to share kind of a few facts that I think would be useful to know. I have seen, I think, some well-intentioned people on these forums arguing that because not every household has broadband, that if we do school at all, we're just throwing fuel on the fire of inequity, and so we should just end the school year right now. I respectfully disagree with that, and I'll give you a few facts that kind of help explain that. So it is true factually that there is a percentage of American households that are not connected to the internet, or that do not have broadband internet. And 10 or 15 years ago, the vast majority of people who did not have broadband internet at home were low-income families and rural families. Today, the largest share of households that don't have quote unquote broadband internet at home are actually cord cutters. They are, primarily college age and millennials who rely on their cell phones. And those services are well enough that they no longer see value in having cable internet. And so they've cut that off. And so we have to look at those statistics kind of in context and know that in reality, it's only a very small percentage of families that truly cannot get online at home. But this is not to say that the reality for most families is there's a broadband internet connection and a device available for every person in the household that wants or needs one right now. More likely is that there's some degree of internet access at home. Some families will have faster internet than others. Some will have internet connections that are so slow that some things like streaming high quality video are either painful or impossible. And there are also many families that need to share devices in order for everybody who's learning at home or working at home to be able to accomplish the things that they need to do. So that then demands some opportunities for students to time shift. If we have one computer at home and mom has a really important meeting at 10 or she'll lose her job, then that means I can't join a live math lesson at 10. And so we need to be able to provide some accommodations for that. And that's one argument for really prioritizing asynchronous content and using synchronous meetings just enough to maintain community and to explain those things that really need kind of custom explanation to students, but also to allow for a degree of flexible pacing so that those students that need to time shift a good part of their school day to the evening can do that, so that younger siblings, mom or dad, can also do the things that they need to do, passing around the one or two devices that they might have at home. So a few strategies to think about: making as much content downloadable as possible rather than relying exclusively on streaming. Remember that even over a pretty slow connection, if you have enough time, you can download a video and watch it. But if a video is only available as a live stream, then your ability to watch and interact and get anything out of that is highly dependent on you having a faster connection. Second, remember that many low-income families in particular who are on the internet using phones and not desktop class, desktop computers or Windows or Mac laptops. And so as much as humanly possible, try to choose apps and sites that display well on a smartphone. When I'm working on designing a course, I'll usually have like my main computer on my desk that's kind of my go-to and that I like, but I'll also, I also have a Chromebook over in the corner, and then my phone sitting on the charger on the desk. And when something is really critical, I want to look and see how it displays on all three of those. And if it looks good on a phone, I'm good to go. And then lastly, in terms of uploading content, try to make those file sizes as small as you can. And I know a lot of teachers right now are doing home video recordings of lectures and demos and kind of daily messages to students, and I think that's great. I would encourage them that, when they upload those to YouTube or Vimeo or whatever hosting site they're using, that they choose one of the lower frame rate options, even though that means it won't look quite as crystal clear as it would if we uploaded it in 4K. But 480p video uses only a fraction of the bandwidth. It plays smoothly on most mobile web connections, and it looks pretty good as long as it doesn't contain a lot of text. Remember, this is the resolution that all television was in for most of human history, and we got content out of it then, and we can do it again while we need to. Then lastly, I just kind of wanted to point out to you this really great graphic that I blatantly stole from Daniel Stanford. So thank you, Daniel, whoever you are. But I think this is kind of a nice kind of grid to think about. It kind of puts things on a continuum of high bandwidth to low bandwidth in terms of how fast of an internet connection do people need to make this work. But then also low immediacy to high immediacy, with immediacy kind of representing potential for collaboration. So for example, if you want to have a live conversation with students, but you have several students that they're on slower internet connections, or maybe they're only on their phone, you might choose to do a text chat rather than a video conference, particularly at those kind of peak times of day. So just a few tips there. And then finally, to wrap up, a few tips. First of all, whatever you choose, experiment and play with it yourself. You don't need to be the world's foremost expert. It's actually valuable if students kind of see you learning a little bit, but do at least try it out a little bit so you're confident enough to be with your students. Back to that concept of trying to manage that cognitive load, introduce only one or a few tools at a time. Don't worry about that super tech savvy teacher down the hall that uses 100 different apps. They've built up to that over a long time, and it might not really even be good pedagogy to begin with. But as long as you have a good tool that you can have meaningful conversations with your students, and you have a tool that gives you a good hub that students can come to start their day and find the resources that they need, that's really all you need. So, a Google Doc, you could do this with a Google Doc and, a chat tool if you need to, and then kind of expand from there as you go, but no more than one or two new tools at a time. Third, talk with students about safety, school policy, and ethical uses of others' content. This is a great time to teach that because, students are learning independently. There are lots of opportunities to cheat because you're not looking over their shoulders. So, this is a great time to talk about ethics and choosing to do the right thing. Be sensitive to technology availability outside of school. We've already talked a lot about that. Give preference as much as possible to tools that are free or open source that let students keep their content. Some of these students will really latch on to some of these tools that you introduce. Like if you think about like how much, like for some people, like their Mac is part of their identity or their Android phone is part of their identity. That can happen with tools that we invest a lot in. So try to choose things that students would have some opportunity to be able to use when you're done, and to be able to have that over time. Be an advocate for student technology access. If you have a student that's a barrier, be a problem solver, and if your school can't solve every solution in real time, be that person that, is creative about contacting neighbors, about, finding out what's available from the library. A lot of wireless providers and cable companies are right now providing free or very low cost internet. So, help students learn about those resources. And then finally, be open to learning from students. I know it's daunting, particularly for some of us that have been around a while. And we have students in our classes that are often more tech savvy than we are, or at least familiar with what's trendy. I think we have to let our egos go a little bit and be open to learning from students and hearing from them what they're using successfully, what they would like to use, and have them help you. So with that, why don't I pause since we're kind of coming up on time, and I'll try to field a few questions from the chat box.
All right, thank you so much, Eric, for sharing that valuable information with us. Let's go to the questions box. If you've got any questions for Eric while he's here, we've still got about 3 minutes before we close out. Please open up your questions panel and type those in now. First comment comes from Megan. This is just a comment thanking you for the presentation. She has a Google Classroom now, and you had great information for the school librarian. So that was a positive feather in your cap there, Eric, for the presentation.
Thanks, Megan.
Laura asks, what advice would you give to preschool teachers about how to use technology with young students?
Oh, that's a great question. First, I want to give you a book recommendation. We had a staff member at CPD a few years ago named Ann Gadzikowski that wrote a whole book on using technology with young students, and it's really brilliant. Gadzikowski is her last name, G-A-D-Z. Susan, I'm going to need spelling help. G-A-D-Z.
Yeah. I'll send it to Arlen.
Okay, great. But I think a few things to bear in mind with choosing technology things for preschoolers. One, even though I know parents have limited time, the young students don't benefit a lot by learning directly from media, but they can learn a lot from interacting with media in the company of a thought partner, whether that's a parent or even a sibling. But there was great research that came out of actually Sesame Street in the 70s and 80s. There was great hope that by introducing all of this educational content into kids' homes every day with these characters that they would really like, that it would really boost reading achievement for students from low-income households when they entered kindergarten. And what they found was that it did have some benefit for those students, but it had an even more profound benefit for less disadvantaged students. And when they investigated that further, what they found was that students that didn't benefit as much were usually watching alone, but students that benefited a lot were watching with other people. And they were talking about what they were seeing, or they were singing along. And it was really the interaction with the other humans that provided the learning value, but the media provided the stimulus and kind of the shared concept that they were grappling with. So, it's great, I think, for preschool age teachers for you to use your online time together to read a book with them and talk about it, or to play a game together and talk about it. The second thing that Anne would talk a lot about is really focusing on using technology to do things that are manipulative, and that, not in a kind of coercive sense, but I mean in terms of being able to physically manipulate virtual objects, or the environment. So I think one thing that can be really positive for students that age are to play 3D puzzle games, or to use 3D building tools. There's emerging research that suggests that those can be really useful in developing visual spatial skills that turn out to be really important much later on when students start learning algebra. They are also a component, that same kind of concept is also a component of a lot of nonverbal cognitive ability tests. So this is also a good thing to do if you have minority and low income populations that are really underrepresented in your school's gifted programs, and you start identifying students at, say, 3rd or 4th grade to do more of these kinds of things with your kindergartners, preschoolers, 1st graders, we think might have some potential for help narrowing some of those gaps too. So those are a few things that I would look at, and we'll try to maybe compile some preschool specific resources that we can share after the fact too, but hopefully that gives you a couple of ideas.
Excellent, thank you, Eric. Jolynn says, I'm a preschool teacher. I use an app called Seesaw, S-E-E-S-A-W. It is a great way to communicate with parents and do online portfolios.
Agreed. Yeah, I know a lot of people that are big Seesaw enthusiasts. So yeah, I think that's definitely one worth checking out. Thanks for the tip.
Angela asks, do you have any resource recommendations for accommodations and/or strategies for special education students that can be applied?
Yeah, that's another resource that we can post to. There's a couple of resources that I think are worth sharing. One is really kind of focused on the basics of universal design for learning, and that's just really about making content as accessible as possible. It's designed for students with disabilities in mind, but then the idea is that it also makes things more intuitive for other students who might not be formally identified, but may have, less intensive disabilities, or might need some targeted support from time to time, even though they might not rise to the level of being formally diagnosed. And then I can also share a resource that is just a simple set of website design guidelines from the deaf and blind communities that just give some basic tips about how to lay out a page. And I think most of those suggestions apply to thinking about what we put on our class homepage, or how we might set up the first page in whatever learning management system we're using for our class. So we'll be happy to kind of compile and reshare those resources as well.
Fantastic. And final question here from Lori: what technology can you recommend for early elementary autistic children?
That is a good question. So I would probably kind of go back to that idea of starting with things that are familiar. We know that kind of one of the characteristics of students on the autism spectrum is that they often experience change with a higher degree of stress than many other students. And so probably for starters, it might be a good idea to survey the student, or talk with the student, or talk with the family about what that student or what that family does online at home anyway, and look for opportunities to kind of tie in some of those tools, so that at least the technology part of it is more familiar and less daunting. A second strategy that I think is helpful for all students, because one of the things that we're trying to do is to create some sense of normalcy and keep students feeling connected with their peers, is to kind of emphasize the idea of creating a daily schedule. And for students who have autism spectrum kind of related learning issues, it might be helpful to encourage parents to print out that schedule every day, where students can see it, or maybe do a mini lesson on kind of using calendars, but trying to set up systems that let the day feel predictable to students, and then also take some extra time to check in with those students to talk about how they're feeling, and be kind of thoughtful about trying to time the introduction of some of your more challenging activities for times when they're in a relatively good place to be able to grapple with that. And then finally, I would encourage, as much as there's capacity to do it, to bring those intervention specialists into your online spaces as well, particularly if those folks are seen as resources for those students at school. It can be particularly reassuring for those students to know that those folks who are often their advocates at school are in their space and are still watching them and looking out for their best interests, and looking for opportunities for them to continue to do that work too.
Eric, I would add specifically for students with autism, the Weissman Center at the University of Wisconsin-Madison has a lot of resources, and they have put up a special page specifically related to working with students during this period with COVID-19, when we're doing a lot of remote learning.
Great, thanks for that suggestion.
All right, last question we have time for comes from Beth. Do you have any recommendations for resources for students who speak languages other than English?
Yes. Well, first, I would encourage, as much as possible, and again, going back to that idea of multiple means of representation, to think about whether, what is important, in a particular lesson is, the concept or the language. So if you're teaching a science lesson or a math lesson, and you're using, a game, an educational game, or you're using a Khan Academy video, anyway, there are Spanish language versions, multiple language versions available of a lot of those. Go ahead and include those and make them visible to all students. There may be students that are just curious, what it sounds like in Spanish or what it sounds like in French. And as much as possible, just try to make content available in the students' native languages. I know that's not going to be possible for a lot of teacher-made content because most of us only speak 1 or 2 languages, but some of us work with students that, speak, 8 or 9, different languages at home. So the second recommendation I would make, and again, this kind of goes back to kind of looking at opportunities to maybe develop some of those spatial skills that are developed through more like manipulation versus explicit instruction. Those block manipulation puzzles and games are not verbal, and so it doesn't particularly matter if a student's first language is English or Somali or Mandarin, but kind of prioritizing some of those as well. If you have support available in schools for working with your EL students, you might try to tap into some of those people as resources too. And then lastly, I would say that the silver lining on the terrible news that this is not just an American crisis, but a global crisis is that teachers all over the world are kind of in the same boat. And so it's quite likely that there are teachers in the country where that student's home language comes from that are also creating resources. So, if there's an opportunity to do some Googling and connect with a community of educators there that might be able to share some suggestions, that's great. And universities in those countries can be great resources because in most countries of the world, even though the primary language, is the local language, all over Europe and a lot, parts of South America and much of Africa, universities operate in English. And that means there are bilingual people available there that can probably make suggestions.
Perfect. Well, that brings us to about 10 after. So we're going to pause on the questions here. If you've got further questions, you can follow up with Eric or Susan. Their email addresses are on the screen. I will be sending out a link to this recording, this webinar recording, as well as a link to the PowerPoint presentation to those who were in attendance today and also those who registered. This webinar will be archived on edleadersnetwork.org as well with all of our other live events. If you hover over the courses tab, you can click on live webinar recordings there. I appreciate everyone's time during this time period here, joining online and asking great questions and ingesting some great content from our friends there at Northwestern. You are free to close the GoToWebinar control panel, and that will log you out of the session. Thanks, everybody. Stay well.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good afternoon.